Hi long range hunting, and welcome to our video series on scopes for long range hunting. Now, scopes are one of the things that I get the most questions on, especially from new guys coming in. They're wanting to know what type of optic to get, what certain features are. And so this video series is going to be diving in and breaking down the different components and help you better understand. So when you go to pick your scope, you know exactly what you need and what you're getting. Now, today we're going to start off this video series, part one, with first focal plane and second focal plane scopes.
Send it. Hit.
Now we're going to start with second focal plane, which is the older of the two. Now, what does this mean? So when you have a second focal plane scope, your reticle, for one, is going to be across the entire scope. It's going to stay that way. So the reticle itself does not change in size. It stays the exact same. So you always have it the same size of thickness. It goes from one side of the scope to the other, and top and bottom. And the thing that's going to actually change, though, is the image. So, because it doesn't move, if you're zoomed in, that target, whatever you're looking at, is going to increase in size because you're zooming in and seeing that. And so if you're looking at your reticle, that target is going to become larger. So let's say it fills 1 mil. Well, that target, if you go back down to half power, now that instead of 1 mil, you're going to see it as half a mil. And the reason being is the reticle staying the same, but the gap in between how much field of view you see and the spacing in between grows just because that target is shrinking as you zoom out. So there's no actual change in the reticle, it's just the picture that you're getting. So the problem with this is when you're using a mil or MOA style reticle, which is what you're going to want to use, it can change what the values are. So most second focal plane scopes, when your mils are correct, or your MOA, which means that they're exactly what they should be, for mils that's 3.6 inches at 100 yards, so 1 mil would equate to that, or at 1,000 yards that's going to be 36 inches. For MOA, you're looking at 1 inch per 100 yards if you're going to shooter MOA. True MOA is 1.047 inches, but most people just go with shooter's MOA. But that is going to be true at that adjustment. So that increment, whether it's 1 MOA or if it's 1 mil, is going to be correct only at that maximum power setting. Now, you can find out what your half is and you can back it off, and then it's going to double in value. So 1 mil now becomes 2. And that's a way for people to shoot on a lower power setting and still have their mils true, but it gets tricky. You know, sometimes people back off and they forget. So the mils are only true on really 2 settings. Your full power, which is where they're going to be ideal, and you have half power where it's going to be doubled. Now, problems with a second focal plane with this is, as expected, you're only true on 1 power setting. So what does that do? That limits the amount of power that you can run if you're using your reticle at all. Because if you've got to have it on those 2 settings, mainly on maximum, you're going to want a lower power range, so that most of the guys that do this will run anywhere between 10 power and 15 power, and that way they just leave it on that maximum power setting and they shoot all distances there. That way they don't have to worry about it. They want that bigger reticle, which a lot of people for close-in hunting try generally to say that second focal plane is the best for that. I'll touch on that in a second, though. Now, there can be problems with higher magnifications with second focal planes. So having it on your max and either limiting it or getting a second focal plane that's higher. Like, there was a couple SWAT guys that came out to Badlands for a class I was at. I was down there helping out, And these guys were running 20-something power night forces, second focal plane. The problem being is when you go to mill in that class, which is you're using your reticle to measure a target to find out distance, or setting up for shots where they had to do holds, etc. The problem being was they were on such a high power setting that Mirage was completely blowing them out. They could not see. Now, when you go to mill targets, a problem that you can have with Mirage is it can actually blur those edges. And so the higher the magnification, the more distortion in that image, and the more Mirage plays an effect. And so it affects you in your ability to, especially in hot conditions, actually get a good range to the target if you're doing that. And it really hurt them as far as, second focal plane's okay when they're on those higher powers for a short period of time, but when you're 4 days in or 10 hours in on a stakeout or whatever, that can really just absolutely drain you and really affect your shooting because of that eye fatigue. Now, another issue you're going to run into with the second focal plane scope is the curvature of the glass. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, as those edges of the glass, because that glass is not flat, as those edges, it curves, what can happen is the reticle goes from one side to the other and top to bottom. So when you get to that curvature, it can actually cause your mills or your MOA to be slightly off because of that curvature. And so what you need to do with your reticle period is get on what's called a milling tree. Basically what it is, it's kind of like making your own reticle out of wood or metal or whatever. And what you're going to do is take tape or something like that, and you're going to space those sections just like a reticle in that correct. So if you're looking for 100 yards, you want MOA, you're going to do it at 1 inch. And so every 1 inch, it's going to be able to line up your reticle on that and then see if your MOA is true. Same thing with mills, every 3.6 inches. And so what it allows you to do is find out if your max power is actually correct or what power it actually is correct. But also it's going to show you if those edges are going to be accurate. Some scopes actually have little increments on the bottom and on the side for milling. They'll have, smaller increments if it's a larger increment. If you have half mils, it'll break it down to 2/10 of mils. But the problem is, if that scope is having that problem with that curvature, you could be getting bad readings as far as your milling. Now, second focal plane scopes also have limited reticles compared to a first focal plane. So you don't have quite the amount of options. You're limited on your power setting. Now, I have second focal plane scopes still. So I use them. I've used them for years. So you can definitely get by. You can shoot with them long range. You can hunt with them long range, short range, whatever. You just got to understand the limitations of that scope and really understand what's going to work best for you. Now let's talk about first focal plane scopes. Now, unlike the second focal plane scope, where that reticle stays and just the image grows and shrinks, what happens with a first focal plane is that reticle is actually going to change size. And so let's say you have it on a power and you have 1 mil. Well, no matter if you increase that power setting or you reduce it and go down in power or magnification, what's going to happen is that reticle is going to change in size. It's going to grow and shrink, so it's always true. So no matter how far you zoom in or zoom out, it's always going to be true. So those increments in your scope are always going to be 1 mil at that target. So if that target's 1 mil, guess what? No matter what you're doing, it's always going to be there, which makes it really nice. You're not having to worry about, oh, do I have it on the wrong power setting? Did I have it on half and then forget, and now I'm taking a shot and gonna miss? So it alleviates a lot of worry. It also really helps because it makes it so much easier and so much faster. The reason I say this is if, let's say I'm hunting elk. Elk can pop up anytime, it's one of those things, you're in rough terrain and you can get a mid-range shot or whatever, short mid-range, whatever, let's say 400 yards, all of a sudden elk pops out. I've got a quick opportunity to where I can get on real quick and send that round and put that animal down. Well, dialing takes time. So if I go and get on, I've got to adjust my parallax, I got to go through all this stuff, and then I've got to sit there and dial in order to hit that. Now, if I'm using a second focal plane scope, I've got to make sure that that's on. So either I'm having to dial everything or I'm going to have to make sure that that's on the correct power. Now, with this, it doesn't matter. I can have it zoomed down for something coming up closer, and if I get a long range shot, I can plop down and increase that magnification. But if I'm on a slightly lower setting, so that way I can get quicker target acquisition, and something pops out at a mid-range shot to where I actually have to hold, it's very easy. I don't have to mess with anything. All I've got to do is get the distance, put it up there, hold it in my reticle for both wind and elevation, and send that round. So it allows me to do accurate Kentucky windage, basically. Kentucky windage is an old thing they would do where they basically hold up and over. So you would basically be just guessing. With reticles like the Horus and other quote-unquote Christmas tree style reticles, it allows you subtensions that are accurate. And so what you can do is get accurate wind and elevation holds, no different than if you were dialing. So it's the exact same thing, just a different method. And so it really gives you advantage in speed because you can either dial or you can hold. You don't have to choose between, and if time's an issue, you can quickly get on for that shorter or mid-range shot and get that animal down to where, you know, seconds could matter, and having to sit there and dial could potentially mean that you're not going to get that animal. Now, it also allows you a large range of magnification. Now, with the second focal plane, like what I said, a lot of people will just simply get a lower power setting for their maximum, run it at that, or they'll run it at half power, or they just simply dial all the time. And what this allows me to do, and I really like it, because I can get a higher power setting than what I normally would shoot at. The reason being this is nice, if I'm, you know, hunting elk or something, or mule deer, and we're glassing, we see an animal, we move in, we get on target, and, you know, I've seen through the spotting scope or binos what we're looking at. But then once you get on the rifle, then you've got to acquire that animal again. And so there can be other animals around, and you want to make sure that you are on the right animal. So what I'm going to do is, this is one of my Smitten benders. I run it. It's a 5-25. And what I can do is get on, zoom in, so I can get really good target identification on my animal, make sure there's nothing behind it, etc. And then I can back off to where I'm comfortable shooting, where I want that, and then send that round. So it allows me that flexibility to zoom in, see it, and then back off for my shot. Or if the situation presents where I have to speed up that shot, I can take it on that maximum power if I want to. So it's one of those things that gives you flexibility. And it's also, you know, the opposite. If I'm sitting there watching an animal and I need a little bit more power to zoom in, and I want to make sure I'm really getting on that good, you can do it. You don't have the limitations of a second focal plane. Everything's always true, and it alleviates worry, basically. You're not forgetting something. You don't have to worry about it. As long as you're comfortable with that power setting and you can see your subtensions, guess what? You're good to go. Now, the reticle's available for this because you do have more options and a lot better reticles. And the fact that, one, it's the same and it's a first focal plane is, let's say you're going out at longer ranges, extended ranges. Well, with this, it's really easy because even if I max out my elevation, so let's say I've dialed so much that I have completely maxed out my elevation adjustment, I can use that reticle then, not only for wind, but for elevation. And so I can double up basically. Now let's say I needed 12 mils. My elevation maxed out at 10. All I got to do is hold 2 mils in that reticle and it's good to go. And again, it doesn't matter what power setting, whatever. And so it allows you to utilize both the reticle and the turret together if you need to get that extra elevation in order to engage that target. If you're shooting as far as target shooting, the animal, whatever the case might be, it allows you for quick capabilities. In conclusion, which one is right for you? Which one's best? That's a question I get all the time. The answer is you. What you find the best is what's going to be best for you. Now, are there a lot of advantages to a first focal plane over a second? Absolutely. This is something that's newer compared to, you know, second focal plane scopes, which have been around forever. But this came around in order for especially the tactical community to, instead of guys having to compensate with a second focal plane scope, they were able to use a first focal plane scope that eliminated those potential issues. And so it makes it much more easier on the operator. It's highly effective and gives you a lot of advantages. Now, one of the most common things that I get about this, and I want to touch on, I talked about earlier, is close range. Now, a lot of people like, especially low light conditions, the second focal plane. They like that reticle being larger. Now, does that mean a first focal plane can't do it? Absolutely not. Realistically, we're talking about long range here. And in long range, you're rarely going to be going on that lower end. You know, this is a 5 power on the low end, and I don't think I've ever used it that low. Quite honestly, I mean, most people, even just shooting 100 yards, are going to have a minimum of 10 power on, whether it's a second focal plane or a first focal plane. So they're going to have a certain amount on there. Now, as you get smaller, because that reticle does grow and shrink, when you're on that minimum power around 5, it looks like a duplex reticle. So it's no different than using an old school duplex reticle style of where you're just aiming that center part there. And when you're at those close distances where they're talking about low light, close range, or even if it's not low light, they're just talking about close range, they don't see the reticle as well. But guess what? When you're, 100 yards point of aim, point of impact, you don't need those subtensions. It's not really a factor. And so the whole reticle size thing doesn't really matter because you're not having to use those subtensions to begin with, whether it's a second focal plane or a first focal plane. Another thing you can do, like with this, is get an illuminated reticle. Guess what? If it's a little bit light for me, even if I'm at long range, all I have to do is turn on that illuminated reticle to whatever power setting I want. Now, you can have it to where the entire reticle lights up. It can only be certain spots or just a spot dead center. And so it's not that you can't engage. As long as it's legal shooting light, you can with this. If you're having trouble seeing your reticle, flip that illumination on. Problem solved. You're going to be able to see exactly where your point of aim, point of impact is. If a problem a lot of people have, and they don't understand this, is in low light conditions, different scopes are going to perform differently as far as that light gathering. Now, when you're in low light conditions, and people who film will find this out, there's a big difference between camera work and what you can see in your naked eye. There's times where your camera, it's too dark to film that hunt, yet you're in legal shooting light and you can actually see. And the same thing can happen with optics, especially the more you're zoomed in, the darker it's going to appear. It's not going to be giving you as much light, versus if you're on a lower power, it's going to give you more light. And so if you're in those low light conditions up close, backing off all the way is going to be your best friend to be able to see better. And then you can also utilize that eliminated reticle, or just use it simply as a duplex style reticle. Both scopes get the job done. They have for a long time. Do I prefer a first focal plane? Yes, I'm slowly upgrading all my scopes to first focal planes. Now, I still have a couple. I won't ever get rid of them just because of sentimental value, but for all my hunting that I do, I'm running strictly first focal plane at this point. There's so many more advantages to it. I don't have to worry about anything. I can do quick holds. I can do dialing. Generally speaking, because I shoot a lot in wind, I'm going to be holding wind. I'll dial my elevation, but when the wind's switching directions and all that, it takes time to sit there and dial. And you can sit there and spin that turret the opposite way and the wind can switch again. Instead of, I'm just holding and just going back and forth, tracking that wind and breaking the shot when the wind is right where I need it. Or, just in that flow, whether it's in the middle of that flow, the end, as far as that peak of that wind, you have lapses and lulls. So both have advantages. The only disadvantage to the first focal plane really is just that the reticle gets really small in that low end. But as I said, there's ways to combat that. So I'm going to leave it up to you on which one is better for you. For me, first focal plane all the way. Years of doing this and doing all kinds of different stuff. For me, it's the way to go. If you're sitting on a bench, doing bench rest, a lot of those guys like second focal plane, but they're also not dealing with the real world conditions. So You know, if you look at a lot of the PRS, the more real world condition competitions, you know, the Hunter series of the NRL, if you look at hunters, military, etc., they're all going to first focal plane, and there's a reason. So I hope you guys have found this educational. I hope you found it helpful for you to go through this path. And scopes are such a rabbit hole. I mean, you can really dive in that I could make this video go on for 10 hours talking about all the different stuff in there. So I'm just breaking each section down. This was first focal plane and second focal plane. We're going to be talking turrets, parallax, reticle options, tube size, the whole 9 yards, and do this series in little bits. That way you can watch when you can, and you can get a full and broad spectrum of what are the pros and cons. And then once you've looked at all that factual data and supporting stuff, you can say, okay, this is what I want, this is what I need, you know, this is going to limit my options to, you know, this, and this is what I want to get. And then you can move forward with an educated view on it, and hopefully get exactly what you want without wasting any money. So everybody, I appreciate it. We're going to continue diving into this stuff. We'll have gel tests coming soon again. I got to get those loaded up and get out there and do that. But everybody be safe out there. Happy hunting.
Hope you enjoyed this video, and make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and turn on notification bell so you won't miss out on any future video, and happy hunting.